Before you dismiss this as just another strange story from the internet, look at what was actually found. Not a blurry legend, not a drawing from a forgotten book, not a rumor passed from channel to channel. A real site, real stone, real geometry, real questions. Because somewhere far from the headlines, a newly identified location has started pulling one of history's strangest mysteries back into the light. And the moment the first images appeared, people noticed something deeply unsettling. The layout looked familiar. The scale felt wrong for the official timeline, and the design seemed to echo a style that many thought belonged only to old maps, lost records, and whispered theories. Tartaria. For years, that name has lived in a strange place between history, speculation, forgotten cartography, and internet obsession. To some, it was nothing more than an old geographic label used on antique maps. To others, it became the shadow of a lost civilization, an erased empire, or a world we only partially understand. Most people never expected that name to become attached to something new. But now, a newly discussed site is doing exactly that. And whether this discovery turns out to be a misunderstood ruin, a forgotten architectural complex, or just one more clue in a larger historical puzzle, one thing is certain. It has reopened a door that many people thought was already closed. Because when you look closely at this place, the first thing you notice is not what it is, it's what it resembles. Massive stone forms, unusual alignment, unexpected symmetry, repeating patterns that feel deliberate, not accidental, and a strange visual language that seems almost too refined for a place that was supposed to be lost, ignored, or forgotten. That is where the mystery begins. Not with proof, not with certainty, but with resemblance. And sometimes, resemblance is enough to start a fire. The site itself does not come with a dramatic label carved over the entrance. No one found a giant plaque declaring that this was part of Tartaria. There was no perfect preserved archive waiting beside it. What people found instead were fragments, layouts, materials, angles, proportions, details that should have felt local, isolated, or ordinary, but didn't. Because once the first comparisons began, observers started noticing echoes of something much bigger. The arches looked familiar. The stonework looked familiar. The spacing looked familiar. Even the visual rhythm of the structures felt strangely connected to architectural forms that appear in places thousands of miles apart. And that is what gave this discovery its power. Not that it answered the Tartaria mystery, but that it seemed to belong to the same conversation. For a long time, Tartaria has existed as one of those words that instantly changes the atmosphere in the room. Say it casually, and most people will shrug. Say it seriously, and suddenly the conversation splits in two. One side sees old maps and outdated naming conventions. The other sees missing history, unexplained design, and patterns that official narratives do not fully satisfy. This new site enters that divide like a spark landing in dry grass, because it arrives at exactly the point where uncertainty becomes irresistible. The location is being described by some as newly discovered, by others as newly identified, and that distinction matters. Sometimes a place is not physically unknown. Sometimes it has been sitting quietly for generations. What changes is not the ground beneath it, but the attention around it. A site can exist for decades without meaning much to anyone. Then one detail gets noticed. One image spreads. One comparison is made, and suddenly the same stones begin telling a completely different story. That may be what is happening here. Maybe this site was always there, waiting for someone to look at it from the right angle. Maybe it was catalogued and forgotten. Maybe it was misclassified. Maybe it was dismissed as a local ruin with no broader significance. And maybe now, for the first time, people are seeing it through a different lens. The Tartaria lens. And that lens changes everything. because the Tartaria idea is not driven by one artifact, one map, or one building. It survives because of accumulation. A dome here, a tower there, a station, a hall, a city plan, a facade, an old photograph, a coastline, a pattern in stone, a symmetry too precise to ignore. On their own, each detail is easy to explain away. Together, they form an atmosphere, a feeling that the official story might be simpler than the world actually was. That is why this newly discussed site matters. It adds one more piece to the atmosphere, one more place where people look at the structure and think, why does this feel connected to something larger? The geometry is one reason. Across many historical debates, geometry has a way of quietly unsettling people. It is one thing to discover age. It is another to discover intention. When lines align too neatly, when proportions repeat too elegantly, when a site appears organized around a logic deeper than convenience, people begin to suspect design on a level that demands explanation. This site appears to have exactly that effect. There are suggestions of planned spacing rather than random accumulation. There are indications that sections of the site may have been built according to a repeating pattern. There are visual relationships between parts of the structure that imply knowledge, not improvisation. And that is where the Tartaria conversation grows louder, because one of the enduring fascinations surrounding Tartaria is not merely scale, it is coherence. The idea that a forgotten world, if it existed in any meaningful sense, would not only build large, it would build consistently, beautifully, systematically, in a language of architecture that could be recognized even after names, borders, and records were lost. When viewers encounter this new site, that is exactly what many feel they are seeing. Not chaos, but order. Not erosion alone, but intention. Of course, intention is dangerous territory. It invites interpretation, and interpretation invites projection. A weathered foundation can become a fortress in one mind, a ceremonial platform in another, and a half-ruined civic structure in a third. That is why discoveries like this are so powerful online. They do not arrive as conclusions, they arrive as invitations. Look at this, compare it, explain it, and once that invitation is accepted, the site begins to expand far beyond itself. People start comparing it to old illustrations, to remote masonry, to structures found in forgotten corners of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, to buildings whose official dates do not seem to match their ambition, to patterns in city design that feel too elegant for mere coincidence. Then the bigger question takes over. If this site really does echo those forms, what exactly are we looking at? A regional style lost to time? An unrelated but visually similar ruin? A rediscovered chapter of architecture that historians simply have not connected yet? Or something that feeds the deeper and more controversial suspicion that many fragments of the old world once belonged to a wider story than we have been told? That is the emotional center of Tartaria content. Not certainty, not evidence beyond dispute, but the haunting possibility of missing context. And missing context changes the meaning of everything. A stone is just a stone until you know where it came from. An arch is just an arch until you know who repeated it. A ruin is just a ruin until you realize its design appears somewhere impossibly far away. Then suddenly the object does not change. The frame does. That is why the newly identified Tartaria site feels so compelling. It arrives inside a cultural moment where people are already primed to ask whether history is more fragmented than the textbooks suggest. It is not landing in an empty landscape. It is landing in a world already filled with unresolved visual mysteries. Old maps that use names no one fully agrees on. Buildings that seem too grand for their documented past. Photographs that look like they captured the aftermath of stories no one recorded properly. And structures whose purpose still feels slightly out of reach. This site does not stand alone. It plugs directly into that network of unease, and once it does, every detail starts to matter. The condition of the stone, the height of the remaining walls, the relationship between open space and enclosed space, the direction of certain lines, the possibility of buried or collapsed sections not yet visible, the question of whether the site once extended much farther than what remains today. People studying the images point to repeated motifs. They notice proportional choices. They compare the surviving forms with decorative and structural habits seen elsewhere. Some even suggest that the site looks less like a simple ruin and more like a node, part of a larger system, once connected to roots, settlements, or architectural traditions now mostly erased. Whether those comparisons hold up is exactly the kind of debate that fuels the mystery. But the fact that they arise so quickly tells you something important. This site has visual force. It triggers recognition. And recognition is what keeps a mystery alive. The deeper one looks, the stranger the emotional effect becomes. The site feels old but not primitive, damaged but not random, silent but somehow expressive. The surviving forms seem to imply that something larger once stood here. Not necessarily larger in height, but larger in logic, larger in purpose, larger in cultural significance. This is where the discovery becomes irresistible to audiences, because people do not just want ruins, they want echoes. They want to feel that what they are seeing is the surviving edge of a much greater structure, physical or historical, that has almost disappeared. And Tartaria, more than almost any other mystery label on the internet, offers exactly that sensation. It turns fragments into echoes. It turns architecture into testimony. It turns visual anomalies into invitations to imagine a lost continuity stretching across time and geography. This new site is now being pulled into that imaginative current. And once that happens, every missing piece becomes as interesting as the parts that remain. What stood above the surviving base? What connected to the visible edges? What knowledge shaped the geometry? Why does it seem both local and strangely universal? Why does it feel familiar to people who have never seen it before? That last question may be the most important. Familiarity is powerful. It is what makes people stop scrolling. When a site no one has heard of somehow looks like something people feel they have already encountered, in old stations, ceremonial complexes, monumental facades, forgotten halls, or antique map illustrations, it creates instant narrative gravity. The viewer thinks, "I have seen this language before." And from there, the mystery writes itself. Some observers focus on the possibility that the site reflects a forgotten architectural vocabulary rather than a forgotten empire. That may sound like a smaller claim, but it is not. If a newly identified site preserves a design language shared across wide regions, then even without sensational conclusions, it still raises enormous historical questions. How did those ideas travel? Who taught them? Why do traces appear where direct contact seems uncertain? What institutions, networks, or movements carried this style? And why do some of these places seem to fall out of mainstream attention so completely? Even the most cautious interpretation leaves room for astonishment, because to rediscover a site is one thing. To rediscover a pattern through that site is something else entirely. And patterns are what make history feel unfinished. This is why the best way to understand the Tartaria fascination is not to ask whether every theory attached to it is true. That is too blunt, too simplistic, too easy. The deeper question is why so many people keep feeling that something is missing when they look at certain ruins, certain buildings, certain maps, certain photographs. This site appears to trigger that same response, a feeling that the visible facts are real, but incomplete, a feeling that the labels are present, but insufficient, a feeling that the stones are speaking in a dialect we almost understand. That almost is where the obsession lives, because complete mystery can be ignored, complete certainty can be filed away. But partial recognition, That haunting sense that you are looking at something meaningful just beyond your ability to name it is nearly impossible to forget. And that is exactly the emotional architecture of this discovery. Not enough to close the case, more than enough to reopen it. If this truly is a newly identified site with meaningful connections to the broader old world mystery, then what happens next matters. Not in the dramatic sense of hidden forces rushing to suppress it. The more interesting question is simpler. Who studies it seriously? Who documents it carefully? And who resists the urge to turn it into instant mythology before the evidence has time to breathe? Because these moments can go in two directions. In one direction, the site becomes content only. Screenshots, dramatic edits, speculation loops, certainty without patience. That path is exciting for a week and empty after a month. In the other direction, the site becomes a real point of inquiry. Measured, compared, placed beside similar structures, studied for technique, origin, layout, orientation, and context. That path is slower, but far more dangerous to shallow explanations. And if there really is something unusual here, patient attention will reveal more than sensational certainty ever could. That is the paradox of Tartaria content. The strongest mystery does not come from shouting the loudest. It comes from looking the longest, from noticing the pattern no one notices at first, from asking why the same visual language keeps resurfacing, from refusing to flatten wonder into a slogan. This newly discussed site deserves that kind of attention, because whether it turns out to be a major historical clue or a beautifully misunderstood ruin, it has already done something important. It has reminded people that the world is still not fully catalogued in the way we like to imagine. There are still structures waiting to be reseen, still records waiting to be reread, still places whose significance changes the moment someone compares them to the right thing. History is not only made of what was built, it is also made of what was overlooked, and overlooked places can be explosive once the right name attaches itself to them. Now, for this site, that name is Tartaria. Maybe that connection will grow stronger. Maybe it will collapse under scrutiny. Maybe future study will place the site in a completely different category altogether. But right now, in this moment, it has done what all powerful discoveries do. It has made the familiar world feel slightly less settled. It has made stone feel unfinished, maps feel incomplete, architecture feel more like memory than construction. And perhaps that is why so many people cannot look away. Because beneath every great historical mystery lies a much more personal fear. Not that the past is gone, but that it is still here, fragmented, misnamed, standing quietly in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally recognize it. So if a new Tartaria site really has just been discovered, the biggest story may not be the site itself. It may be the reaction. The speed with which people recognized the patterns, the hunger to connect it to something larger, the strange relief in realizing that the old questions are not dead after all, because maybe what keeps Tartaria alive is not a single map, a single empire, or a single ruin. Maybe it is the recurring experience of finding places that feel older, deeper, and more connected than the modern world seems comfortable admitting. Places like this one. Newly seen, newly framed, and suddenly impossible to ignore. If even one overlooked site can reopen this much mystery, imagine how many others are still out there, unlabeled, misread, or waiting for the first image that makes the world look twice. And once the world starts looking twice, history is never quite the same again.